How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Euler Gonzalez. You know. Let's take a look now at the Model 3 of React hooks as another tool in the toolbox when working with React. Particularly, you need to describe now UI interfaces that I now understand. For example, what is that Josh Komeva, the author of this course, based on his experience and also in my own experience, is that when you have one particularly pattern, way of doing things, you're going to replicate that in any place. So in other words, it's like you're having a hammer, and because you have this tool, you're gonna nail anything in your house, right? So this is pretty much with the component, and I also had have a course describing about is JavaScript, particularly is the scope and the closures. When in there, I talk about and also take some notes from this course, called the You Don't Know GS series, Jet, the You Don't Know GS Jet series from Kyle Simpson, a software engineer that has previously worked at several companies. And now he wrote this series of book as a way to actually now, from the JavaScript perspective, as the developers, be able to understand now in the most practical way, not in the abstract, not in the mathematical and also relevant, but too much abstract. So more a practical sense of how we now get things done in JavaScript, and it is all about is now components, particularly is on the models and how now these models allow us to define is all of the relevant piece of information along with its behavior functionality, everything in the one single bundle, and only expose things that are relevant, right? So any private details you hide that, you abstract them from somebody to go with, right? And this is pretty much what here on the components in UI, particularly on building web applications in React, this is what we have, right? So just to make a very straightforward overview of how do we get here or how do I get here is by looking at the first, the introduction of the React. So a little bit of history of when this arose. So it was uh, developed by a bunch of software engineers back in 2011 to 2009, and then they make that public in 2011. When they have now a particular problem Facebook to handle is now how you can update is different UI that share a common piece of information, a common state. So now the R&D come up with a plan, and then with some prototypes known as the React, and that React actually allows us to define is the user interface, and bound is a state. So no matter where you are using is this application, or no matter where you are using is this component, which is a user interface, now you can is holding that piece of information, right? And when that piece of information updates, any place where you have now defined that state in all of these different UI elements, now they're gonna update, they're gonna keep in sync. That's great, very interesting, powerful, useful to describe that and understand that this is for the web. And now we have all the different environments we can run user interfaces, or we can express this user interface, which is the web, the mobile with React Native that target is different platforms, whether it's iOS and yeah, whether it's iOS, the Windows phones, Android, and also is the WebLG, the 3SGS. I do find that this is also another thing that I'm going to explore that later on. Might not be in today's video or in the next fourth month, but yes, in the long run, right? Uh, but in any case, so as we look at the origins of this, when it comes from, right? And now, because in order to understand how you can create this user interface, we look at the plain vanilla way of doing so. Okay, so at the end of the day, React is just a nice little wrappers around is the DOM elements where you can now attach different attributes and update those attributes when you see fit. So at the end of the day, React what it's doing is create when you create an element is just to describe is this state of the application as a JSON like the state of this UI. All right. So I also look at how can we create is now several of these elements, how tedious it is. That's why we use now GSX. What is the difference between GSX and HTML and other templating language, and understand how you can now create is these applications in this particular way, this user interface in this specific way, which is by looking at the components way. So now the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, everything is in one single bundle, right? That represent is a particularly UI or particularly behavior, and it is relevant data. Okay. So I also look at the features that now React give us to us. So for example, like fragment, what a fragment is, also how we creating our applications in this new way of building web apps. When you have now the entry point, you have now the index, which is act as the entry point where you're going to mount all of these different components. The app home where you're gonna put now all of these relevant piece of informations and components or also context, something we're gonna see that later, but you're gonna put all of these different piece of data that you want to share across your entire application. And then you have now the models where you define is your specific UI components. Also, how you can now render a collection of elements using the list operations like map, filters, and so on and so forth. And how you can now conditionally rendering elements here, whether it's using if or else. We're using is if statement and the expressions like the ampersand or the ternary operator. Okay, and what is the trade-off or when you can use each one of them. And also is that how you can add is CSS to this specific components. So via these CSS models that conveniently now when we build our applications is going to now generate some random hash CSS with the specific component names and the class that we provide, and then it's going to attach that to the particularly HTML tag and define that huge or define your set of CSS rules as inline CSS, right? So content that live, as internal CSS. So CSS rule that live is at the top of your document, not explicitly in those elements. So this is just to summarize the model 1. And in model 2, we look at how can we add now is this interactivity to these user components. And that is by exploring how now we interact with events prior to React. You have two ways, whether it is attaching an event listener to an event, right? So based on a event, you're going to run this function, right? And the other is that in that particular HTML tag, you now pass is the function you want to execute, okay? But in React here, because we are delegating is this interactivity to React, so when so we are passing control to React to call our function for ourselves. This is known as the inversion of control, right? So we are not explicitly handle that function execution. We are passing down to React through these event handlers, all right? And it is up to React to trigger that. And when that happens, if we want to now add interactivity to these applications, we can use the core loop known as the use states to hold this piece of information in our applications that is going to be relevant per component. And when you want to update this state, it's going to pass through the core loop, which is the trigger, the render, and the commit. So when you are initially loading your applications, it's going to create all of these elements using the document or the append child document methods that is going to create is all of these user elements, HTML elements in the browser, all right? And when a particular component that has a state now trigger a state updates, so it's going to detect that in the trigger phase, and then it's going to now render, aka it's going to spot the difference between two different snapshots, and this snapshot our computing is based on the component that trigger that state updates, and it's going to continuously call all of the other components down there. So here, all right, because these components now triggers this function call, these function calls now are going to generate is this state of the UI as a JSON object, and if this component has more React component, it will continue to create that until there is no more React components, aka you now hold is the new state of the UI known as the virtual DOM, right? And the virtual DOM is just a technique to hold is this DOM in memory and then sync with the real DOM to apply only the bare minimum necessary DOM updates. So that is the rendering process, and once that's done, when the React now call of these React components and then spot the difference between them, it is time to apply those bare minimum updates to the real DOM. The DOM change, the browser detects those changes and then paint the specific UI. So this is the core loop. If you're able to describe that, that's power to you. A lot. A lot. Oh my God. Yes, it is. A lot power to you. Yeah. Yeah. So well, I also look at the difference between rendering here in React and rendering in the computer graphics. That's actually the two separate things here, because in computer graphics you take now unprocessed raw data and speed up now a output here, the final output here. Usually when you want to, for example, now render is models in some of these computer graphic applications, Blender, is a good example. And then you want to now is have a two-dimensional image or a video of this model. Like, let's imagine here you have now a Link and Ganondorf, right? So you have Link and Ganondorf from Zelda. I don't know if you're quite familiar with that. And then you want is to is based on these 3D models, you want to generate now a two-dimensional image. But now in React is now spotting the difference. Okay, that's what the render it is. At least right now in 2025. Okay, so I do think if they change this behavior, which is something that they might do, all right, it will take some time to do that. Again, at the end of the day, all of this industry is evolving, so deal with it. But that is the core loop. And also now, how can we is attach or response to user inputs events, okay? And most commonly is when you wrap that into a form, you put now a label, and this label with the form you want is to select that particular input as well. Okay. So here we use is the HTML form attribute from the label to actually now select is the React or the input. And when you want to detect, if you want to now make the user events response handled by React, this is known as the control input. You now define as a state and bind that to the value and the setter functions to update to the event handler, right? So because in the input we have several of them, and each one of them has a specific behaviors. So for example, input text range, input text range, password, all of them behave quite similar. That's not true for context area or for the select as well. So now JavaScript, what it does is to say, hey, let's go to now have a unified way of detecting these changes and update them via the on change or on input, and then binding its value to the value, right? So it saves us a lot of work in this specific domain, which is now creating forms and collecting data from the forms. That is something that a lot of the time, these developers, the JavaScript developers and React developers actually needs to understand. They need to go into this to see by themselves. Then I also look at how you can now is generate dynamic data, and it is important, especially if you're rendering a collection of elements. You want to each one of them to be a unique to React, so you can keep track of those elements. And why is not useful for us to use the index, and especially if that index is going to rearrange. So if you're going to if you're going to resize, so that is definitely something that you don't want to go. If for some reason the dimension of that array is still the same, you can use is now the index. If it's not, then it's preferred for you to generate is ID, dynamic ID for that. So one way to do that is by using mat.random, or the other is by using is the crypto.random. So we also look at something that we're going to see in this video, is that how now is when you want to hold these unique values, how useful is to use now particularly hook. All right. So, but before going into these hooks, right, React hooks, I also look at the way of how you can work not only with basic or primitive values to hold as an state, but also with complex objects. Right? So complex data structure. So the objects here. And the TLDR is that anytime that you find yourself in the need to work with this complex data, well, it is preferred for you to generate a new state of that object, right? Whether it's an array or whether it is an object. And if you find yourself in the need to specify is a initial value only once, you now pass is a function. So working with these complex states is something quite straightforward. If you have one level nested object, so no big deal, or two nested objects. But after you started to have now multiple nested objects instead, you see that it's quite tedious to actually is copy all the state, copy all the properties and values from the upper levels, right? And then now modify only those that are relevant in that specific level, okay? So this is why, for example, libraries like Imer actually make that life quite allegedly quite simpler to help you with dealing with this complex nested state. I do find that if you find yourself in that place in a UI, you should now is keep your object flat as much as possible. So yeah, that's my recommendation. So in any case, so after that, right? After we talk about is this. Where is it? Where is it? On the model 3 and hooks and yada yada yada, right? And I also look at well the thing of lifting the state up as a way to identify is how you're going to now pass is certain data and setters, and this is more like how now React actually organize is this UI, right? Some of the state management tools that are out there, when to use this state management, right? If you have now a back office and you're dealing with small data set, sometimes there is no need to go with. But if you find yourself for example, now building applications that need to be ranked by Google and so on and so forth, you definitely need to hold that state on the server. And that's why, for example, using libraries or frameworks like Next is a good way to go with. Using now Redux as well. So, but in any case, I also look at how I can create now is a basic UI examples, and I do find that very, very compelling and interesting by creating is this this is known as Wordly. Is you have 6 attempts to find out a 5 character. It is a 5 character word, right? And yeah, so you get the idea. So yeah, so you get the idea. And the first thing is, well, and this is something for any problem that requires some systematic level thinking, right? So what is the input and what is the output? And then define some naive approach, okay, to come up with, so you can then also, well, know, so develop a particular algorithm, a naive approach, look at the trade-off, and then if you want to refine that, okay? So yeah. So yeah. Oh my god. All right. Okay, cool. 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 This was quite. This was a quite interesting project, by the way. Yeah, yeah. That's a very interesting project. In terms of how do you use now React as a way to create this complex layout, all right? And how do you use, for example, utility functions like range that help you to actually is generate those. I would prefer to go with this built-in operations, right? Don't get me wrong with this uh, the utility functions. Uh, but again, I prefer to go with anything that is built in by the language, right? Because I don't have to rely on these external third-party languages and all the things that they need to handle and so on and so forth, you know. So make it our app. So we Redux is the surface of updated and vector attack. Okay, and the other thing is that as I create that wordly, the game logic to actually figuring out that, and to also look at how you can, as you render your application or you render a series of collections, you can also is now compute something to provide a specific style to that. That is mind bending shit. That was a mind bending thing. And interesting, by the way. So here we are, right, in hooks. So after I look at these two models, and this particular project now is on model 3, which is the React hooks. Okay? So on React hooks, where we first look at this another tool in React. So the reason of exploring this is by looking at how with this component ways of building applications we actually now is used for all the use cases that we have, right? So back in the or prior to React 16, most of those components were written in JavaScript, like uh, in a class or an object programming, right? So you have now your class when you define now your state as well as the and also I do think that's quite very interesting to recap about it. Absolutely, absolutely. The model 3, that's right. So another tool in hello, okay, which is this, another tool in the toolbox. Since I look, right, since I look at how app or how component UI is the way we is the way React apps are built. So prior to React 17, we wrote or apps were written, okay, prior to React 17, apps were written in a class component way, right? So for example, like this, as he holds.
So when I started using React back in 2015, things looked pretty
Back in 2015, goddamn.
different than they do today, and our way of creating components was using this create class method. Essentially, we would call this function, we'd give it this big object that described our component.
All right. Dig it. All right. Which is this. Nope. This one, yes. So we got is this. So well, and here, so we got a big, or we got, so we got a function provided by React. Interesting. To build that describe is the state, our handlers, right, and the render function for this component, right?
We would have like specific React stuff, like we would give it a state property, and this would be the state for our application. And we were able to access specific methods and properties using the this keyword. And this was the case for a couple of years, a few years, until eventually the team came out with class components. And you've probably seen these if you've read some tutorials online. They're still used today, although it's pretty clear that they're on their way towards being obsolete. Structurally, they're very, very similar, right? Like we can kind of just tell broadly from looking at the two that they have a lot in common. There were some little gotchas with this, like actually there's a bug in this code that you had to sort of structure this as arrow functions, otherwise this would be set to the wrong thing because, my goodness.
Okay. And then the React team, then the React team now build or now make components in components using classes, right? Like this. So we gotta deal with the value of this and that sometimes can be very hard to spot. But in any case,
I am so happy we don't have to work with the this keyword anymore in React. But structurally it was very, very similar. It was mostly the same thing. And for most of React's life, like it's a relatively new development in 2019 that hooks became a thing. For most of React's life, this was the tool that we had. This was the one tool in the toolbox we had, components. And components are fantastic, right? Obviously, I'm a fan of components. There's something really nice about being able to bundle like the markup that we need, the styles for that markup, and the logic that controls it into like one handy package, and we can reuse that package all over our application.
So what he's describing is encapsulation. Okay, so that's what it is. So you have all of these things that are relevant in this small bundle. Particular in this case is the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. So the logic, the markdown, the markup, and the style, everything here, and then you can use this in any place as you see fit, right?
Sometimes we have this chunk of business logic that needs to be integrated.
Which is here. So the component enable is encapsulation of the logic, markup, and style, right, in one single bundle that is easy to carry over, right? But sometimes we do need but sometimes we do need is to add some business logic to our app, which is where
integrated with React, and it feels pretty darn clunky to have to use a component for that. And
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it feels pretty darn clunky. The French toast is that? Pretty darn clunky. 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 Lagging grace in movement of posture. Okay, clunky. Lagging face in booster or monster. Clunky. What the hell is even this nigga? Clunky. Clunky meaning. Or in Spanish, the hell is even that? Okay, but not as an image. Oh. Tosco. Clunky. Oh, that feels pretty clunky. Tosco. En español. Oh my god. I'm learning vocabulary. Shit. Yes.
Clunky to have to use a component for that.
Exactly. But sometimes we do need is to add some business logic to add, and it feels pretty darn clunky to use a component for that. And this is pretty much what we
And
do.
one of the examples of that is this idea of render props and using animation libraries that worked in this way. So this is a library called React Motion. And essentially, we would create this motion element, and we would say, all right, I want the opacity to start at 0, but I want it to animate to 1. And we would use this spring helper so that it had this nice animation curve.
This nice animation.
And this is interesting, right? We would give it
because we were giving it a function that is going to accept is an opacity, okay? Yeah, we were giving it a function instead of having a
function instead of having a regular child, and that.
We were giving it a function instead of having a regular child, and that will receive the opacity to apply that to the style to see
that function would have an opacity property, and we would use that in our markup. I know that I'm not explaining this super well, and I don't have to because this pattern thankfully isn't used super often anymore, but effectively we can think of this as like we gave this component some input.
Exactly, we gave this component some inputs.
And it gave us an output. And because components were the only tool in the toolbox, if we wanted the animation to be synchronized with React state, we had to create a component. We couldn't have like a regular function. And it meant that our React application got flooded with these components that existed for a purpose other than rendering user interface, right? The real thing this is doing is processing data. Like it's handling like a logical thing, not...
Because what you're doing is this component is receiving some inputs and then it's going to now generate something.
A UI thing. And it wasn't just animations. There were a bunch of things that worked this way. I have screenshots of code from... There were a bunch of things that worked this way.
Okay. Oh no, I want to take a snap of here. That's right. So, some libraries ends up doing this kind of things, which is Finder, some libraries ends up doing things end up doing kind of, kind of these things, right? Where the whole purpose of this component is just to process data. That's all. That's all. You're receiving an input, do something, they generate some output here, right? So instead of passing now is an element or child, you're passing now is a functions that's gonna take in the opacity and attach it to the style in the markdown. So we're no need to explain that too much because this is not a pattern that is used.
I have screenshots of code from earlier versions of React that kind of show this pattern.
Okay. Okay. So there is okay. So there is some screenshots of using this pattern of just processing data. Okay. So these components their whole purpose is just to process data, bro. That's what it is. That's the whole point of this. It's just to process data.
This is a bunch of components, and granted, I don't know what each one of them does, but most of the components in this whole chain, they're not rendering UI. They're doing some sort of business logic thing. Like Apollo is for doing network requests. Connect is for fetching data through context that we'll talk about a little bit later. We have all this.
Apollo is for fetching. There you got it.
Or fetching data through context that we'll talk about a little bit. Each one of them does. But most of the components in this whole chain, they're not rendering UI. They're doing some sort of business logic thing. Like Apollo is for doing network requests. Connect is for...
Exactly. In this case, it's just describing this. So in this example, Apollo is just connect. Okay. In this example, Apollo is just handling network. Exactly. It's just for handling network requests. Okay. Connect is to fetch data connect is to pass data through context. Okay.
Fetching data through context that we'll talk about a little bit later. We have all this stuff like error policy, authentication, right?
So error policy, authentication. Yep, authentication.
None of this is about creating a user interface. It's about doing the data manipulation needed further down the tree for that user interface.
Exactly. So all of these layers are doing some sort of data manipulation to be used in those manipulation to be used in those on those lower levels, or to be used in the UI.
And I have this other example, which unfortunately is a little bit blurry and hard to see, but it has a bunch of these different things. Like these first three components up here, they're all about doing a transition, so another animation use case using components. We see we have another example of connect, pulling data through the React tree. We have scroll to top route.
Data to the React tree.
So really, this component is just about scrolling the user to the top when it renders. We have loadable component, which is a component whose only purpose is to lazily load some other component. Right? Do you see how when your only tool is components, we tend to overuse them, right?
In this case, yeah, this might be a little bit more blurry. Okay, which is something that is going to experience a lot with this kind of application. You're going to experience that a lot in this kind of applications. So another example, a little blurry, is this. We're now here. Okay. So another example, a little blurry, is this, right? So we got transition. So we got transition to handle. We got transition components to handle transitions in our UI. Also the connect to pull data through the tree, and the loadable components that only handles is if a component is lazily loaded or not. So you see how now when the only tool that we have is component, we overuse it in any place, right? So it is like having a hammer in your house and use it to nail everything.
It's like we only have a hammer, and so we go around our house like hammering in the screws instead of screwing them in with a screwdriver.
Right? It's like having a hammer in your house and then hammering over the screw instead of screwing around. I'm not quite familiar with that because this is now something that is off my domain.
Around our house like hammering in the screws and
okay, hammering in the screws
instead of screwing them in.
Hammering in this screw. Okay, screw.
With a screwdriver. Only have a hammer, and so we go around our house like hammering in the screws instead of
hammering in the screw. They call it screw here. Oh, tornillo. That's interesting. Again, this is another domain that I'm not quite familiar with. Screw. Interesting. Tornillos. Here we go, bro. Okay. It is like having a hammer in your house and then hammering in the screw instead of screwing
them in with a screwdriver.
Instead of screwing them with the screwdriver. That's interesting how they call that screwdriver. Lo que nosotros en español llamamos es un desatornillador. Holy shit. Lo que nosotros llamamos un desatornillador, ellos le llaman un screwdriver. That's interesting. And that makes quite sense, you know. O sea, in Spanish, when you translate that, it's like you're calling this a something to drive here. But in Spanish, that doesn't have any sense of it, or at least so far, I am not Spanish. I'm a Spanish native speaker, but I don't have the analysis and the I haven't digged too much in my root, my native language, all right. But the name it is called desatornillador. Holy fuck. Desatornillador. So atornillador, tornillo y desatornillador. It's interesting. In Spanish, you call is like so. This is the screw, and then you call that is the off screwing, something like that. You know, that's how you can translate it into English. It's an off screwing instead of saying it's a screwdriver. That's interesting. Screw, right? You have no screw instead of screwing them with a screwdriver.
Because like that's the tool that we have. We have to use it.
Exactly. Because that's the tool that we have. We have to use it.
And so the React team has come up with a second tool, a dedicated way for us to share business logic across our application without having to like stack a million components in our application like this, or without having to come up with these like overly clever practices for funneling data through a component that ultimately doesn't produce any UI of its own. And the tool that they came up with is called hooks.
Exactly. Right. So React. So the React team comes with this another tool called hooks.
Now we've seen an example of this already in the use state hook, and over this module we're going to learn about a few others that solve discrete problems. But the
okay. So in the previous video, in the previous model, I look at one of them, but here we are going to look at several of them for discrete uses. And I'll be right back. All right, let's keep going.
brilliant thing about hooks, the really cool thing about them, is that they allow us to reuse logic just like our components. So where we have like a button component that we can use wherever we need a button, now we have a event listener hook that manages a specific event listener in a specific way, or manages a specific data request, right? Any concern that we have that needs to be used in multiple components can now be packaged up in a really
Okay, I really love about this. So any concern So any concern about yeah, that's right. So any concern about clunky, bro. So any concern about reusing, exactly, or any concern about using multiple
used in multiple components can now be packaged up in a
exactly. So any concern about using yep. Interesting. Would you mind to send it again? Because I couldn't receive anything yet. Could you resend the email? Just for double check. Exactly. So any concern about using some piece of information, but this is concern about using something
that manages us. We can allow us to reuse logic just like our component.
The French toast is this, bro?
So when I think it's things like these first three components up here, they're all about doing a second state hook. And over this module, we're going to learn about a few others that solve discrete problems.
But again, it's this.
But the brilliant thing about hooks, the really cool thing about them, is that they allow us to reuse logic just like our components. So where we have like a button component that we can use wherever we need a button, now we have a event listener hook that manages a...
Exactly. This is exactly any concern about using a piece of logic through our application. All right. So any concern about using a piece of logic through our application in multiple places. So hooks, similar like a component, when you define a button to be used here and there, now you can is defined as event listeners. So now you can define event listeners or data fetching here.
Specific event listener in a specific way, or manages a specific data request.
So you can define an event listener to manage it. Okay, to manage it in a specific way, or to do some data fetching requests, or do some uh, data requests in some specific ways, right? You got all of this, and that makes a lot of sense.
Right? Any concern that we have that needs to be used in multiple components can now be packaged up in a really tightly integrated way that's totally tied into our React application. And my goodness, is it a one.
Exactly. So you can now exactly wrap it up. But again, this is logic. And okay, since we are now in JavaScript land, we can also is now scheduling. So any of the APIs, it can have its own hooks, can have its own logic, uh, or even yeah, any web API can have its own logic. That is storing data locally, requesting for data, um, or even audio and videos, painting something on a canvas, so on and so forth. Even check if the current navigation, check for the geolocations. But any of these APIs, we can now wrap them here. Okay.
Pattern. And I say this like as someone that was actually a pretty big advocate of stuff like this. Like I have a conference talk from 2016 talking about how good render prop.
ReactEurope.org, Wrangle.io. Oh, exactly. It's using this translate for that. Translate message.
Are. And like, I was doing the best with the tools that we had at the time. But looking back, it feels a little bit like I was happily riding along.
Even though translation here.
On my horse.
Translation here.
Not knowing that cars were around the corner. And that's not to say that hooks are perfect. Everything has trade-offs, right? There are certainly certain problems that were easier with class components than they are with hooks. But by and large, right, overall, I am a much happier and more productive developer with hooks. They have greatly increased my workflow. And I really hope that this module is the one that starts to get you excited, if you're not already, about building with React. Because when you start to get the hang of how hooks and components work together, it is a magical feeling, and it makes React really a ton of fun. So without further ado, let's dive into it.
Damn, son. They now over the notification allow me to send this. That is something. Hmm. I'm trying to change my bathroom. I don't have access. Will you? Anyway, so what I'm going to do here. So what we're doing here is looking now at this specific discrete hooks. for use exactly. So using discrete hooks here.
So when I started using the cars were around the corner, I am a much happier and more productive developer with hooks. They have greatly increased my workflow. And I really hope that this module is the one that starts to get you excited, if you're not already, about building with React. Because when you start to get the hang of how hooks and components work together, it is a magical feeling and it makes React really a ton of fun. So without further ado, let's dive into it.
So what I'm doing in here is just looking at the overall of this another tool that React team come up, a little bit of history of how do we get here, and then now these discrete hooks that allows to the discrete hook for specific use case, or the discrete hooks as he mentioned.
It's not to say that hooks are perfect, everything, but looking back, it feels a little bit like I was happily riding along my horse. Really a pretty big advocate of stuff like this. Like I have a thing that we have that needs to be used in multiple components, can now be packaged up in a really tightly integrated way that's totally tied into our React application. And my goodness, is it a wonderful pattern. And I say this like as someone that was actually a...
And yeah, he described it.
So where we have like a button component that we can use wherever we need a button, now we have a event listener hook that manages a specific event listener in a specific way, or manages a specific data request, right? Any concern that we have that needs to be used in multiple components can now be packaged up in a really tightly integrated way that's totally tied to props are. And that's not to say that hooks are perfect. Everything has trade-offs, right? There are certainly certain problems that were easier with class components than they are with hooks. But by and large, right, overall, I am a much happier and more productive developer with hooks. They have greatly increased my workflow. And I really hope that this module is the one that starts to get you excited, if you're not already, about building with React. Because when you start to get the hang of how hooks and components work together, it is a magical feeling and it makes React really a ton of fun. So without further ado, through a component that ultimately doesn't produce any UI of its own, called hooks. Now we've seen an example of this already in the use state hook.
Yeah,
and over this module, we're going to learn about a few others that solve discrete problems. But the brilliant thing about hooks, the really cool thing about them, is that they allow us to reuse logic just like our components. So where we have like a button component that we can use wherever we need a button, now we have a event listener hook that manages a specific event listener in a specific way, or manages a specific data request, right? Any concern that we have that needs to be used in multiple components can now be packaged up in a really tightly integrated way that's totally tied into our React application. And my goodness, is it a wonderful pattern. And I say this like as someone that was actually a pretty big advocate of stuff like this. Like I have a conference talk from 2016 talking about how good render props are. And like, I was doing the best with the tools that we had at the time. But looking back, it feels a little bit like I was happily riding along my horse, not knowing that cars were around the corner. And that's not to say that hooks are perfect. Everything has trade-offs, right? There are certainly certain problems that were easier with class components than they are with hooks. But by and large, right, overall, I am a much happier and more productive developer with hooks. They have greatly increased my workflow. And I really hope that this module is the one that starts to get you excited, if you're not already, about building with React. Because when you start to get the hang of how hooks and components work together, it is a magical feeling and it makes React really a ton of fun. So without further ado, let's dive into it.
All right, so yeah.
So when I started our application like this, produce any UI of its own. And the tool that they came up with is called hooks. Now we've seen an example of it, and my goodness, is it a...
So what I'm going to do here, and I know that can be quite repeated, is I want to get is to extract the exact terms to describe the things what we're going to do in this video. And also to see that, well, take a look at the React docs to get yourself familiar with. And that's it.
Wonderful pattern. And I say this like as someone that was actually a pretty big advocate of stuff like this. Like I have a conference talk from 2016 talking about how good render props are. And like, I was doing the best with the tools that we had at the time. But looking back, it feels a little bit like I was happily riding along my horse, not knowing that cars were around the corner. And that's not to say that hooks are perfect. Everything has trade-offs, right? There are certainly certain problems that were easier with class components than they are with hooks. But by and large, right, overall, I am a much happier and more productive developer with hooks. They have greatly increased my workflow. And I really hope that this module is the one that starts to get you excited, if you're not already, about building with React. Because when you start to get the hang of how hooks and components work together, it is a magical feeling, and it makes React really a ton of fun. So without further ado, let's dive into it. That's the tool that we have. We have to use it. And so the React team has come up with a second tool, a dedicated way for us to share business logic across our application without having to stack a million components in our application like this, or without having to come up with these overly clever practices or funneling data through a component that ultimately doesn't produce
funneling data over a component,
an UI of its own. And the tool that they came up with is called Hooks. Now we've seen an example of this already in the
and he doesn't mention about is what we're gonna see in this.
Things looked pretty different than they do today, and our way of creating.
So, but in any case, here is that we are going to use. So we are going to look at some of the discrete use cases for this specific tool, which is wrapping around now logic in a reusable package that we can use across all of our app. And unlike now components where it encapsulate it is markup style and logic in one bundle, so here we have now a specific tool that allows us to reuse that logic exclusively across all of this part of our app. And one of them is the use ID hook. Okay. Okay. The use ID hooks. Right. The use ID hook. You got it. Yes. The use ID hook. Question. Before going into this, I do want is to look at the React def. Alright, especially the reference. And here is this. So this is React 19 hooks. So you have now several of these hooks. It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense of what a hooks is. We also look at the components. Again, all of these are provided by React. The profiler, that's interesting to let you measure and rendering performance on a tree of a React tree programmatically. Okay. Measuring rendering programmatically, measuring different part of the application. Strict mode, suspend is another one. Activity, that you hide and restore the UI and internal state of its children. Okay. Mode is showing sidebar visible or hidden. So when active boundary is hidden, React will visually hide its children using the display none CSS property. It will also destroy their effects, cleaning up any active subscription, while hidden children still re-render in response to new props, albeit at a lower priority than the rest of the content. So when the boundary becomes visible again, React will reveal the children with their previous state, restore and recreate their effect. Okay, all right. The view transition, which is part of the, this is quite interesting. So CSS actually now is on this thing. So the view transition is part not only of the React channel, but also view transition is one of these behaviors or add rules that we have in CSS. Okay, so the other is the APIs, act, catch. This is for React server components. Catch signal, capture owner stack, create context, lazy, memo, start transition, use. Use is in React lets you read the value of a resource like a promise or a context. Interesting. Okay. Start transition, memo, lazy. This is part of the API in React. Okay. And on the DOM, okay, makes a lot. This is the Surface API. All right. So you have now hooks, which is something that we're gonna talk in today's video. One of them is use ID. All right, for generic unique ID that can be passed to the accessible attributes, right? This is why you need to actually generate is this. We'll look now at this, especially with this simple example here. Use imperative handles, use insertion effect, layout. So we have all of this specific logics that are useful in developing React apps. Okay, the components, again, some helper utility components. Fragment is one of them. Profiler, strict mode, and suspense, and the other is the APIs. So I am not quite familiar of using APIs, by the way. No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Okay, and memo. Okay, and this is the React DOM. Hooks like this, use form status. Okay, the components on the React DOM, which is creating is now all of this nice wrapper around this. Okay, similar for input, the option in the select, the progress here, the select, the text area, link, meta, script, styles, and title. What's the other one? APIs here. From the DOM, create portal, flush sync, pre-connect, prefetch DNS. Okay, client API, create root and hide rotate root, and server API, which is rendered to build. Oh, there you go. And then static API to pre-render those nodes and create this static site generation. And then you have now the compiler, which is some configuration that it has, as well as directive, use memo, use no memo, and compiling libraries. The React DevTools, which is the React Performance Track, linting, server, components and functions, and all of that legacy. Okay. All right.
So one of the cool things about React is that it really prioritizes this idea of reusability, right? That's one of the things you hear, is that React is about reusable components. And I think when we think about reusability, we often think in terms of like buttons or inputs, the low-level Lego bricks that we can imagine peppering throughout our application. I actually think this idea should be used a little bit more broadly, though, and I try to write my components in such a way that any component is reusable, no matter how much it might seem like you wouldn't want to reuse it. The thing that makes this a bit tricky, though, is that there are certain parts of the web platform that strongly disagree with this idea, that don't want everything to be reusable. There are things on the web that are supposed to be globally unique. And I want to look into one of these examples. So I have this website, creatively called Some Website, and it has a login form in the header. If we dig into this code a little bit, we see we have two state variables, username and password, and they're each
Mm. 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 Okay. And side effects. Mm-hmm.
each driving their own input. Now, because I care about accessibility, I've made sure to give both of these inputs a unique ID, login form username and login form password, and I've created labels that are associated with that ID using the HTML4 attribute. This is important for two reasons. The first is that we want to make sure that when I click the label, it focuses the input, right? I don't have to click within the box of the input, I can click the label. This is especially important for like checkboxes and radio buttons, because, they're all tiny. But there's another thing that this does, and I think arguably this is more important, which is if I'm visiting the page with a screen reader and I focus an input, by default, all it will tell me is that this is an input with type text, right? This is a text input. What am I supposed to put in that input? Well, that's what labels are for. Because I've set up this label and associated it, the screen reader will announce that this is asking me for my username, which hopefully makes clear that this is a login form. And so this is set up correctly if I only have one of these forms, but this page actually has two of them. I have a second form down here. And notice what happens when I try to focus these inputs by clicking the label. When I click the username down here, my focus is pulled all the way to the top. And this happens because both of these inputs are using the same ID, right? This username input, both of them have the exact same value. And on the web, we are never supposed to repeat ID. That's the whole purpose of an ID, is that it's globally unique. So how do we solve this problem?
Mm-hmm. So the use ID hooks. So despite that in React, everything wants to be reusable. Okay. So despite that in React everything wants to be reusable, the web community is not. So the web community is against to this idea of making everything reusable. So for example, there are couple things that need an identifier, and that's when the use ID for or when the use ID to match the label and the input in a form is 4. If you want to create unique values, whether it's with math.random or with crypto, okay, whether it's with math.random or crypto get UUID, get random UUID, those values will be computed every time exactly, those values will be computed every time so those values will be computed every time we render the component. We can, or I can. Okay. So I can instead exactly. So I can instead receive. So I can instead define a hook or define a state to manually update such state randomly, right? But React offer exactly. So but React offer is a solution uh, by hooking into them to generate a unique identifier across our entire app using that is stable using the use ID. And that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. and that makes a lot of sense. Again, we're just only looking is at the we're just looking is at the most common hooks here in React. Okay, so if I take a look at the React Dev here, right? This is the reference, so on and so forth. And that is that the components, this is something that is provided by React. The components, I am quite familiar with the fragment, the profiler, strict modes to actually verify to if you don't have any loosely used custom hooks, hangout there. And the suspend for handling is now is or to provide now a fallback markup while a component is loading, and then load this component. The activity I wasn't well aware of this activity, but what it does is wrap this component and hide them. Remove them from the DOM via display none, and clean up any listeners. And once you load that, once you activate that mode, well, it's going to now reload that as expected, right? So far so good, no problem at all, right? What the French? What do you have a screw? Anyway, so here we are, right? And the activity, and the other are the APIs, right? The APIs provide to the surface, to developer surface. For example, Act is a test helper to apply pending React updates before making assertions. You might find using Act directly a bit too verbose. To avoid some of the boilerplate, you could use some library like React Testing Library to do so. But this is for testing. Okay. Add transition type. Okay. I do think this is, again, go exactly because to my animation via a transition class, so on and so forth. I am not quite familiar with that. I do need to get into that to get something to understand that. React Server Component catch is only for use with React Server components. Makes sense. Catch signals allow you to know when the catch lifetime is over. Cancel in-flight requests. Again, this is for the server. Ignore errors after React has finished rendering. I find out, well, I didn't find out. I hear at the company that I'm working that they have now they want us to cancel is request. Oh, okay, I do get it why there is a push to do so. They want us to cancel requests that are now has been they want to cancel requests that are now pre-flight or that are not flight. Okay. So they somehow, okay, makes a lot of sense why they are moving in that direction. So somehow they want, this is why we have is abort here, but as a proposal. abort proposal here. In not that kind of abort. I know, it's not that. Is in JavaScript, right? Abort JavaScript proposal. It's possible to form and cancel a promise. And there is some, and I get it. Okay. Okay, but, do we have that, right? Optional, resolvable, rejectable, and cancelable. God damn it. Abort controller. Oh my god, it is now widely acceptable. The abort method of the abort controller. Now this feature is available in web workers. Aborts an asynchronous operation before it has completed. This is able to abort fetch requests, the consumption of any response body or stream. Holy moly, bro. The part of the abort controller as the abort controller here. So you can create an instance, that this instance will have now a signal and abort methods. And you're going to provide now a reason. The reason why the operation was aborted, which can be any JavaScript value. If not specified, the reason is set to abort error. Oh crap, who is capturing this? See the abortion signal page. And then you got another one. This interface represents the signal object that allows you to communicate with an asynchronous operation such as fetch request, and abort it is required via abort controller. Oh crap. So here, let's say you are communicating to that, and then you want to abort that download. By creating a new object that's signaling that, you trigger that. It's like you're holding this reference, you pass it as an object, right? And then you somehow are holding that. Look at you. You are holding this controller here globally, right? And then here on the signal, you are holding that that reference and pass down that. So if the request is aborted after a fetch call has been fulfilled, but before the response body has been read, then attempting to read the response body will be rejected with the abort error here. So you got now the get function. And on this get function, right? When you define is this, hey, I want you to now is pass a signal property, control signal, to now at some point in time abort that. The next line will be throw abort error. The text await.respond.text. Okay, the next line will throw abort error. Holy hell. An abort signal timeout. Abort a fetch operation with a timeout. And I do think this is something that they might need to implement, right? Holy hell. Aborting a fetch with timeout or explicit abort. Okay. This will abort the fetch when either signal is aborted. Either signal or timeout is aborted. An abort signal. An abort signal is okay. An abort signal. Whether it's aborted programmatically or by a time. God damn it. Implementing an abortable API. Unlike when using abort or timeout, there is no way to tell whether the final abort was caused by a timeout. My cool promise, you're gonna get the promise. If the signal is already aborted, immediately throw in order to reject the promise. Signal throw is aborted. And there you got it here. Stop the main operations, reject the promise with abort reason. The API that does not return promise might reach in a similar manner. Okay. Abort signals here. Okay. Oh crap. So here the bound doesn't work. It'll troll here is only letting is one a particular request go out, fly away. Okay. So this is catching cancel in flight requests, for example here. But again, all of this is on the server component. Capture owner stack, create context, lazy and meme. So let's keep going here with the use ID. I am quite familiar of why do we need to use this, right? So now we're generating is unique values in each specific case. All right. Look at this file. That is the logging form, right? So logging form. No. Okay. So logging form, right? And how now that is being rendered. And how now the ID is creating is the same stable ID across render. Right? Okay. And this is practice with toggle components, right? Here I already generate the use ID with that. Okay, this is now like a toggle component. This is not like an exercise. Right, when you have now the whole component and the interactivity to that. Right, similar for this another one. Diggy. And the entry point. of this app. All right. And now let's get into rules of hooks. So we talk about how hooks are special functions that allow us to hook into React internals. Use state allows to hook into components instance state. For example, while useID allows to create and store its unique identifiers on the components instance. So what happens if we try to call these functions outside of React contents? Well, let's see. Okay, this is when the rules of hooks are, right? So what happened if we try to hook into React outside of a function, all right, or outside of the component of the React context, right? So we're gonna have a very freaking error here. So in addition to the lint error, we are giving a console message that looks like this. Warning, invalid hook calls. Hooks can only be called inside of the body of a function component. This could happen for one of the following reasons. You might have a mismatched version of React and the re-render, such as React DOM, and you might be breaking the rule of hooks, which is what the French saws are the rule of hooks, and you might have more than one copy of React in the same app. It shows that something's gone horribly wrong and provides three possibilities. Error 1 and 3 refers to rare edge case concerns, right? Error 1 and 3 are rare edge cases concerns. But what are exactly but what is these hooks, bro? You know? So what is custom hooks? What is the rules of hooks, right? First, let's understand that the hooks are plain old JavaScript functions. They aren't quite as magical as it might seem. But when we call these functions the hooks into React internals, and we can but when we call this function, they hook into React internals. So functions are exactly so hooks are plain old JavaScript functions. Exactly. Okay. They're just plain old JavaScript functions that when we use it exactly. So hooks are plain old JavaScript functions. When I and since so when using it in React, we are or exactly when using in React, you are accessing to the React internals. Or you are when you're so hooks are plain old JavaScript functions. When using in React, you are hooked into it is internal. It is internal. So there are specific way of how you can use it, or bad things can happen. So there is a specific way of using it, or bad things can happen. All right. There are two rules of hooks that we should learn in order to make sure we're always using hooks as React expects. Hooks as whole has to be called within the scope of a React application, and we can call them outside of the React components. Only the exception is that we call the custom hooks, and we'll discuss about this later operations. And we have to call our hooks at the top level of the component. This is okay. So hooks can be hooks have to be called within the scope of React. Okay. So this is the rule, right? So one, hooks must be called within the context of React. Okay. Okay. So hooks have to be called within the scope of React application. Okay. So hooks must be called within the context of React, right? We can call them outside of React component, and there is an exception. Only custom hooks can be called outside of React, all right? And the other is that we have to call our hooks at the top level of the component, and we have to call our hooks at the top of the component.
So let's suppose we're building a form. And to make our life a little bit easier,
when do you say, when you look at this, right? Because this is something that is not described in the, unless you look at the learn here section. You have the setup editor installation describing the UI, right? Your UI as a tree, okay. But when you're adding interactivity or managing a state, okay, state as a snapshot, yeah, it doesn't mention about that, like who's or the hooks, right? The built-in React hooks. If you want to look at what are the rules of hooks, all right, not even the rules of hooks. There you got it. This is on the okay rules of React. Components and hooks must be pure. React calls components. React calls components and hooks. Exactly, you don't call them. React is responsible for rendering components and hook when necessary to optimize the user experience. Never call components functions directly. Never pass around hooks as a regular values, and don't dynamically mutate a hook, or don't dynamically use hooks. Rules of hooks is here. Only calls hooks at the top level, and only call hooks from React functions. Okay. Okay. Holy hell. Okay. Okie dokie, okie dokie, okie dokie, okie dokie, okie dokie. Makes a lot of sense. So only call hooks at the top level, so don't call the hooks inside of loops, conditions, nested function, or try catch finally blocks. Instead, always use hooks at the top level of your React function before any early returns. You can only call hooks with React is rendering at a function component. Call them at the top level in the body of the function component, and call them at the top level in the body of a custom hook. Whether it's on a component or on a custom hook, right? It is not supported to call hooks functions starting with use. In other cases, for example, do not call hooks inside conditions or loops after a condition. Do not call hooks in an event handler. Okay. Do not call hooks in a class component, and do not call hooks inside function passed to use memo, use reducer, or use effect. Okay. And do not call hooks inside of a try and catch finally block. If you break this rule, you might see this error. Bad inside condition to fix, move it outside. Bad inside of a loop, move it outside. Bad after a condition return to fix that. All right. All right. So don't use is inside of event handlers. Okay. Don't use context. Okay. Don't use hooks inside of event handlers. Don't use hook inside of a memo, or don't use hooks inside of a React component or a bad. And only calls hook from React functions. Not a component or custom hooks. Okay, only calls hooks from React functions. Exactly. Only call hooks from only call hooks from React functions for components here. So you can compose these other hooks into another one, into a new one. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Okay.
Here we've extracted this text input component. The idea is that it's going to give us a text input, but also a label for that text input with everything correctly wired. And I want to set it up so that I can optionally provide an ID. Like for the second one, the input ID is going to be my email, and the label is going to be connected to that ID. But if I don't pass an ID, I want React to generate one for me automatically with the useID hook. If we look at how I've implemented this, it seems kind of reasonable. I have this ID prop, which may be a string or may be undefined. I assign it to a variable. If that variable is undefined, it means I haven't provided an ID, and so I'll update this variable to use the useID hook. If they have provided an ID, then this expression evaluates to false, and I stick with the ID that they've provided. And so either way, I'm giving it an ID, whether that's the one they've provided or the generated one. But when I do this, I get a lint warning, and I see a very unhappy red squiggle underneath my hook. And this is like one of the most common stumbling blocks with React. It's the sort of thing that everybody trips over, and then as they're like rubbing their knee, they're scratching their head and trying to figure out why on earth it's implemented this way. Because it really does seem like the most natural thing in the world, but of course sometimes I'm not going to need an ID and I want to do it conditionally. So why is this a problem? Well, that's a rabbit hole that I really don't want to go too far down right now. But I will give you sort of a high-level understanding of what the problem is. And the problem is that React hooks are implemented in a way where the order matters. The way that React can tell which hook is which is by the order that they're being called whenever the component renders. And so if that order changes, because sometimes I'm calling this hook and sometimes I'm not, React doesn't know how to handle that, and it's going to give us warnings, and if we ignore those warnings, it's going to start throwing exceptions. Bad things happen if we try to work around this. And this isn't the best example. Like in here, it actually does seem like it would be fine. But let's look at another example. Let's say I have these two state hooks. I have x, which is equal to 0, and y, which is equal to 5. The very first time this component renders, when the component mounts, I give React the default values for each of these state variables. The first one gets a value of 0. The second one gets a value of 5. And React takes note of this by their order. So it says first hook is equal to 0, second hook is equal to 5. It has to work this way, because it's not like I'm giving React any sort of ID. It's not like I'm saying the first one should have an ID of x and a value of 0, and the second one should have an ID of y. If this was the API, React would be able to have essentially this big object inside where it can tell, like, okay, I have this state variable which is called x, this one which is called y, but that's not the API, right? The API is, as a result, it relies on the order. And let's suppose now I have like some condition where I optionally choose to render this hook or not. If we imagine that on the first render this is true, well then React sets it up this way, where the first hook is equal to 0, the second hook is equal to 5. But what happens if that condition flips to false? Well, now we skip over this code, right? This code doesn't exist. And so the first hook that we call, it thinks is going to be the one that we're currently tracking as 0. And so essentially it's going to give me the value for x when I'm telling it I want y. Now you might be saying, well, wait a minute, I am giving these state variables names. The first one is called x, the second one is called y, the names are right here. But the thing is, React doesn't actually see any of this. The only thing React knows is when we call one of these functions, right? It sees that the useState function has been called, and we've given it some value to be used as the initial value, but on subsequent renders, it has to first figure out, okay, which of these internal state variables do I want to provide, and then it wraps them up in an array with the setter function, and it returns that, and then we, on the consuming side, destructure that array and give it a name, but React has no visibility into the code that we write inside our components like this. I know that this stuff probably seems pretty like abstract and hard to follow, because it's true, React is a complicated tool, and we don't really have that deep an understanding of how it works internally. But the bottom line is that we are not allowed to call a hook conditionally, whether that's in an if condition, or a ternary expression, or even within a function call or a for loop or anything like that. Essentially, it's a little bit of an oversimplified rule, but if we ever find ourselves trying to use a hook while we are indented, where we're not at the sort of top level of the function, we're going to have a problem. We need to make sure that we're calling the exact same hooks in the exact same order on every single render. And this applies even in cases like this, where like realistically, both, this one has an ID of a string, this one doesn't have an ID. They're not going to change. It's not like this is some state variable that's going to be different values on different renders, but all the same, React doesn't know that, and it's the best practice to always make sure that we are not using hooks conditionally. In terms of how we fix this, like how do we solve this problem? Well, I'm going to get rid of this condition entirely. I'm going to create a new variable called generated_id, which is going to be equal to react.useID. And then the applied ID is either going to be the ID if it's provided, otherwise I'm going to use the generated ID. If I inspect this in the DevTools, I see that my text input for name is given the ID of :r10, that's the generated ID with the useID hook. But I see the other one, the email input, is using the string myEmail, right? That's the value that I provided within the app component.
Okay. Okay. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye-bye.